It's Angela from Create a Knit, and if you love knitting or crocheting, eventually you're going to have to make a gauge swatch. I know it can sound intimidating and tedious, but it's really important, especially when you're making fitted garments. So what is a gauge swatch? Well, in essence, you're making a square, either knit or crochet, and then you're measuring those stitches in a certain area. The larger size hook or needles that you use, the less amount of stitches you will get in that given area. The smaller size needle or hook that you use, the larger the number of stitches you'll get in that same area. So gauge is really important because if you're making fitted garments, such as a pair of gloves or a hat or a sweater, you want to make sure it fits properly, because if you don't make a gauge swatch, you could end up making a sweater that could only fit a doll. And you don't want to have to rip out hours and hours of work that you spent making your item. So gauge is really, really important. And luckily, a lot of the patterns in my shop use large needles and hooks and large weight yarn. So you can make one of my swatches in about 30 minutes or less. The first thing you're going to want to do when you start making your gauge is you want to look at your pattern or your project and see what the gauge says on the pattern. For example, if it says 10 stitches equals 4 inches on US 13 knitting needles, then you'll want to start by making your gauge on size 13 knitting needles. And then from there you can adjust it if the measurement isn't quite matched up to the pattern. Or let's say you're working on a crochet pattern that says 6.5 stitches equals 4 inches on a 10 millimeter hook. Then you'll want to start by making your gauge on the size hook that is 10 millimeter, and you'll want to naturally use the size yarn that the pattern requires. Now you can see here that I've made a couple of swatches. This one is crochet and this one is knit, and I make them approximately 6 inches by 6 inches. You can make them a little larger, but you don't want to go smaller because you're not going to get enough stitches to get a really good measurement there. So we'll start with my gauge swatch that I made here in stockinette stitch in knitting. And what you want to do is kind of flatten it out a little bit, but you don't want to pull or stretch on it because it's going to change the number of stitches, your stitch count. So let it lay naturally and lay it out flat. And what you're going to need is a ruler of some kind. You can use this one or you can use a regular ruler, just so long as you get an accurate measurement. Now you don't want to measure too close to any of the edges because the stitches can pucker up or tighten, which won't give you a good reading. So I like to start in the middle, and I find the edge of the first stitch I want to measure by, and I put the beginning of my ruler mark there, and then I take my pin and I pin that right there. Now you don't necessarily need the pins. You could just hold the ruler and count the stitches, but the problem with that is your ruler can slide and you might not get the true reading of your gauge. So hold that in place with your pin there, go to the 4-inch mark and pin it right there. Now you can remove your ruler and you're going to count how many stitches you get in 4 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it looks like we get 10 stitches in 4 inches. Now let's see how many rows we get in a 4-inch area. And this is another way to measure your gauge, is by rows, going vertically. And the stitches, what we just measured before, was horizontally. So we'll measure how many rows we get in a 4-inch area. And we'll start by locating the top of a stitch that we want to start measuring by. So we'll come in there and we'll pin that at the beginning of the measurement. Then holding your ruler, you'll go to the 4-inch mark and you'll place another pin. Now go ahead and remove your ruler and let's count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So we know that we get 14 rows in this 4-inch area. So looking at my gauge swatch and measuring how many stitches I get in a 4-inch area on the size needle and yarn that I used, we know that I get 10 stitches and 14 rows equals 4 inches. Now let's measure our gauge on a crochet swatch that I made here. Now you can see I did this one in double crochet. So we're going to measure horizontally first to see how many stitches we get in a 4-inch area. And you can measure by 1 inch or 2 inch, but I just like to measure by 4 inches because I get a bigger span reading of my stitches. So again, start in the middle and find the edge of your first stitch, or in this case, my double crochet, and hold your ruler right there and pin it at the beginning mark of the measurement. Now holding your ruler, pin the 4-inch mark. Now go ahead and remove your ruler and let's count how many double crochets or stitches we get in a 4-inch area. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and a half. So it looks like we get 6.5 stitches or double crochets in 4 inches. Let's measure how many rows we get in a 4-inch area. So what you're going to do is measure vertically, and you're going to start at the top of your first row and place the beginning of your measurement there. Now come down to the 4-inch mark and place a pin there and go ahead and remove your ruler. Now let's count these rows here to see how many rows we get in a 4-inch area. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it looks like we get 4 rows in a 4-inch area. According to the size hook and yarn I used to make this gauge swatch, I know that I get 6.5 stitches or double crochets in 4 inches, and I get 4 rows in 4 inches. Now here's the big question. What if you make your gauge swatch and you do not get the same number of stitches in a measurement that the pattern calls for? Well, let's say you're doing a knitting swatch and the pattern tells you that you should get 10 stitches in a 4-inch area, and say you get 11. Well, you know that you fit more stitches in that 4-inch area than what the pattern calls for. So what you want to try is going up a needle size until your gauge swatch reads the same as what the pattern calls for. What if you get less stitches in the 4-inch area than what the pattern calls for? Well, if you get less stitches in that measurement, then you know you're knitting slightly looser than what the pattern calls for. So you want to try going down a needle size until your gauge meets what the pattern requires. Well, I hope this simplified making gauge swatches for you, and I hope it helps you along with your projects in getting accurate measurements and sizing. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment below and I will be happy to help you out. So good luck and have fun making those gauge swatches.